Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your own country no longer exists as you knew it. Imagine that your neighbors, friends, and even members of your own family suddenly belong to a different nation. The flag that once united everyone has become a symbol of division, and people who once fought side by side are now preparing to kill each other. It sounds like the plot of a Hollywood movie, but this was the reality for millions of Americans in 1861. The American Civil War was not simply a conflict between two armies. It was a war that tore apart families, destroyed cities, changed the lives of millions, and forever transformed the future of the United States. But one question has puzzled historians for more than 160 years. How could one nation become so divided that it chose war instead of peace? The answer begins decades before the first gunshot was fired. In the early 19th century, the United States was growing at an incredible speed. New territories were being added, cities were expanding, industries were booming, and thousands of immigrants were arriving every year in search of a better life. From the outside, America appeared stronger than ever. Yet beneath that image of progress lay a dangerous problem that politicians had failed to solve for generations. The northern and southern states were becoming two completely different societies. Although they shared the same constitution, spoke the same language, and proudly called themselves Americans, they were beginning to develop different economies, different political beliefs, and different ideas about what the future of the country should look like. The northern states experienced rapid industrial growth. Factories produced clothing, machinery, tools, and countless other goods. Railroads connected cities, banks financed businesses, and millions of workers found jobs in manufacturing. The economy depended less on agriculture and more on industry, trade, and technology. Many people in the North believed that America's future depended on factories, education, and modern infrastructure. While racism certainly existed there, many Northerners also believed that slavery should not spread into the new Western territories. Some opposed slavery for moral reasons, while others believed it threatened free labor and economic opportunity for ordinary workers. The South looked completely different. Its economy depended almost entirely on agriculture, especially cotton. By the 1850s, cotton had become one of the most valuable products in the world, earning the nickname King Cotton. European textile factories depended heavily on Southern cotton, making plantation owners incredibly wealthy. But there was one reason this system was so profitable: enslaved labor. Millions of enslaved African Americans worked on plantations under brutal conditions, receiving no wages and living without freedom. For wealthy plantation owners, slavery was not only a labor system, it was the foundation of their entire economy. They feared that ending slavery would destroy their wealth, their influence, and the society they had built over generations. As America continued expanding westward, a difficult question kept returning to Congress. Whenever a new territory applied to become a state, lawmakers had to decide whether slavery would be allowed there. Every decision threatened the delicate balance between free states and slave states in the Senate. Both sides understood that if one gained too much political power, it could shape the future of the entire nation. For decades, politicians tried to postpone the crisis through compromises. Agreements like the Missouri Compromise and later the Compromise of 1850 temporarily reduced tensions, but they never solved the underlying problem. Instead, each compromise only delayed a conflict that was becoming impossible to avoid. The debate over slavery gradually became more emotional and more violent. Newspapers attacked political opponents with increasingly harsh language. Public debates turned into shouting matches. Entire communities became divided over the issue. Abolitionists in the North argued that slavery was morally wrong and violated the principles on which America had been founded. Southern leaders responded that each state had the constitutional right to decide its own laws without interference from the federal government. They believed Washington was becoming too powerful and feared that Northern politicians would eventually abolish slavery everywhere. What began as a political disagreement slowly transformed into a battle over identity, power, and survival. Then came one of the most important events in American history. In 1860, a relatively unknown lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election. Lincoln was not campaigning to abolish slavery immediately in every state, but he strongly opposed its expansion into new territories. For many Northerners, his election represented hope for a different future. For many Southern leaders, however, it represented a direct threat to their way of life. Even before Lincoln officially took office, several Southern states decided they no longer wished to remain in the United States. Beginning with South Carolina, states started announcing their secession from the Union. They argued that the federal government had broken its promises and that they had the right to leave voluntarily. Soon, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. Together, they formed a new nation called the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis serving as its president. To many Americans, this decision came as a complete shock. For decades, politicians had argued fiercely, but few believed the country would actually break apart. Families suddenly found themselves living in different nations. Soldiers had to choose between loyalty to the United States and loyalty to their home states. Brothers enlisted in opposing armies. Friends who had grown up together now prepared to meet each other on the battlefield. Newspapers across the country warned that war was becoming unavoidable, yet many ordinary citizens still believed that diplomacy could prevent bloodshed. They hoped cooler heads would prevail before anyone fired the first shot. President Lincoln faced an impossible challenge when he entered the White House in March 1861. He inherited a nation that was already falling apart. He insisted that secession was illegal and refused to recognize the Confederacy as an independent country. At the same time, he wanted to avoid becoming the leader who started a civil war. Every decision he made carried enormous risks. If he used force, he might push even more states into joining the Confederacy. If he did nothing, the Union itself could disappear forever. The entire world watched closely, wondering whether the American experiment in democracy was about to collapse. Everything changed on April 12, 1861. In Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, a federal military installation still under Union control. For more than 30 hours, cannon fire echoed across the harbor. Although relatively few casualties occurred during the bombardment, its political consequences were enormous. The attack ended every realistic hope of a peaceful solution. Lincoln immediately called for volunteers to defend the Union, while thousands of men across the South rushed to join Confederate armies. Within weeks, for more Southern states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina joined the Confederacy. The division that had been growing for decades had finally exploded into open war. What many people expected to be a short conflict lasting only a few months would soon become the bloodiest war in American history. Entire towns would vanish, hundreds of thousands of soldiers would never return home, and the future of slavery, democracy, and the United States itself would be decided on battlefields stretching from Pennsylvania to Mississippi. Neither side yet understood the terrible price they were about to pay, but once the first shots were fired, there was no turning back. America had split in two, and the long, brutal struggle to determine which vision of the nation would survive had only just begun. When the first volunteers marched off to war in 1861, both the Union and the Confederacy believed the conflict would be over quickly. Young men proudly wore brand new uniforms, local bands played patriotic songs, and families waved goodbye with smiles, convinced they would be reunited within a few months. Newspapers on both sides confidently predicted victory, while politicians promised that one decisive battle would settle everything. No one imagined that the war would drag on for 4 long years, claim more American lives than any other conflict in the nation's history, and leave scars that would remain for generations. The optimism that filled the streets in the spring of 1861 soon disappeared as both armies met for the first major battle near Manassas, Virginia, known in the North as the First Battle of Bull Run. Thousands of civilians even traveled from Washington to watch the battle, expecting an exciting military spectacle. Instead, they witnessed complete chaos. Soldiers fled in panic. Officers struggled to control their men, and what many thought would be a glorious adventure became a horrifying lesson. The battle ended with a Confederate victory, shocking the North and proving that this war would be far longer and far bloodier than anyone had imagined. As the months turned into years, the scale of the conflict became almost unimaginable. Massive armies, each numbering well over 100,000 soldiers, marched across fields, forests, rivers, and mountains. Every battle left behind thousands of dead and wounded men. Medical knowledge was still primitive, and disease spread through crowded camps with frightening speed. In fact, more soldiers died from illnesses such as dysentery, pneumonia, and typhoid than from enemy bullets. Hospitals overflowed with injured men, surgeons worked for hours without rest, and families anxiously waited for letters that often never arrived. Photography, still a relatively new technology, brought the brutal reality of war into American homes for the first time. Instead of romantic paintings of heroic soldiers, newspapers published haunting images of real battlefields covered with bodies. Americans could no longer ignore the terrible cost of the conflict. Despite the terrible losses, neither side was willing to surrender because both believed they were fighting for the survival of their nation. The Union fought to preserve the United States and prevent the country from breaking apart forever. President Abraham Lincoln repeatedly argued that if states could leave the Union whenever they disagreed with an election, then democracy itself could not survive. The Confederacy, meanwhile, believed it was defending its independence and its constitutional rights. Southern leaders insisted they had voluntarily joined the Union decades earlier and therefore had the legal right to leave it. While slavery remained deeply connected to the conflict, many ordinary soldiers on both sides initially believed they were fighting primarily for their homeland, their families, and their understanding of freedom. This difference in perspective made the war even more emotional because both sides sincerely believed they were defending justice. Everything began to change in September 1862 after one of the bloodiest single days in American history, the Battle of Antietam. More than 20,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in just one day of fighting. Although the battle ended without a clear military winner, it gave President Lincoln something he desperately needed: an opportunity to redefine the purpose of the war. Until then, preserving the Union had been his main goal. Now he announced the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people living in Confederate-controlled territory would be free. Although the proclamation did not immediately free every enslaved person, it fundamentally changed the meaning of the war. The conflict was no longer only about keeping the country together. It had also become a struggle over the future of slavery itself. This decision discouraged Britain and France from openly supporting the Confederacy because public opinion in Europe strongly opposed slavery. At the same time, thousands of formerly enslaved African Americans joined the Union Army, strengthening its manpower and proving their determination to fight for their own freedom. Life on the battlefield remained unimaginably difficult regardless of which uniform a soldier wore. Most soldiers spent far more time waiting than fighting. They endured freezing winters, scorching summers, endless rain, poor food, and exhausting marches that sometimes lasted for days. Letters from home became their greatest source of comfort. Many carried photographs of their wives, parents, or children in their pockets, hoping they would survive long enough to see them again. Friendships formed quickly because every soldier understood that tomorrow might be his last day alive. Yet even in the middle of unimaginable suffering, moments of humanity still appeared. During quiet evenings, soldiers from opposing sides occasionally called out to one another across rivers or fields, exchanging newspapers, tobacco, or even jokes. For a brief moment, they remembered that before becoming enemies, they had all been Americans. By 1863, the war reached a turning point. In the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, two enormous armies collided in what would become the most famous battle of the Civil War. For 3 days, fierce fighting raged across hills, farms, and open fields. Cannon fire shook the ground, smoke covered the sky, and wave after wave of soldiers charged toward enemy positions. The final Confederate assault, known today as Pickett's Charge, ended in disaster as thousands of Southern soldiers were cut down while crossing open ground under relentless Union fire. When the battle finally ended, more than 50,000 men had been killed, wounded, or captured. General Robert E. Lee, the Confederacy's most respected commander, was forced to retreat back to Virginia. Historians now consider Gettysburg the turning point of the entire war because after this defeat, the Confederacy would never again launch a major invasion of the North. While Gettysburg captured national attention in the East, another decisive victory was unfolding hundreds of miles away in the West. After a long siege, Union General Ulysses S. Grant captured the city of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. This victory gave the Union complete control of the river, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two and making it much harder for Southern armies to move soldiers and supplies. The loss devastated Confederate leaders because it exposed a harsh reality. They were running out of resources. Their economy was collapsing, railroads were breaking down, factories could not match Northern production, and food shortages became increasingly severe. Inflation spiraled out of control, forcing many Southern families to struggle simply to survive. Although Confederate soldiers continued fighting with remarkable determination, it became clear that courage alone could not overcome the Union's overwhelming advantages in industry, transportation, and population. President Lincoln understood that military victories alone would not heal a divided nation. In November 1863, he traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a new national cemetery for the fallen soldiers. There, he delivered one of the shortest yet most influential speeches in American history. In just a few minutes, Lincoln reminded Americans that the Civil War was ultimately about preserving a government of the people, by the people, for the people. His words transformed the meaning of the conflict from a political struggle into a test of whether democracy itself could survive in a deeply divided society. Although many people at the time barely noticed the speech, it would later become one of the defining statements of American history. As 1864 approached, exhaustion spread across the country. Nearly every community had lost fathers, sons, brothers, or friends. Cemeteries expanded, hospitals remained overcrowded, and countless families lived with constant uncertainty. Yet despite the overwhelming suffering, neither side was willing to admit defeat. President Lincoln faced growing criticism in the North as casualties mounted, while Confederate President Jefferson Davis struggled to keep hope alive in the South despite shrinking resources. The war had entered its final stage, and everyone sensed that the end was approaching. But before peace could finally return, America would experience one last chapter of destruction, sacrifice, and heartbreak, one that would forever change the nation's future and leave behind a tragedy no one could have predicted. By early 1865, it had become clear that the Confederacy could no longer continue the fight. Years of war had exhausted the South. Its railroads were damaged, factories had slowed, food was running out, and thousands of soldiers had either been killed, wounded, or deserted. Meanwhile, the Union continued to grow stronger, thanks to its larger population, stronger economy, and steady flow of supplies. General William Tecumseh Sherman's famous march to the sea destroyed Confederate railroads, warehouses, and military resources, making it almost impossible for the South to continue resisting. Every passing week brought the Confederacy closer to collapse. In April 1865, the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, finally fell to Union forces. Only days later, General Robert E. Lee met Union General Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Rather than fighting until every soldier was dead, Lee chose to surrender his army of Northern Virginia. Grant offered generous terms, allowing Confederate soldiers to return home instead of being imprisoned. Although small battles continued for a short time, Lee's surrender effectively ended the Civil War. After 4 years of unimaginable destruction, the fighting was finally over. But just when Americans began celebrating peace, another tragedy shocked the nation. On the evening of April 14, 1865, only 5 days after Lee's surrender, President Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. During the performance, actor and Confederate supporter John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln. The president died the following morning. Across the country, millions mourned the man who had guided the Union through its darkest years. Instead of celebrating victory, Americans found themselves grieving the loss of their leader. The Civil War officially preserved the United States as one nation and led to one of the most important changes in American history, the abolition of slavery. The 13th Amendment, passed later in 1865, permanently ended slavery throughout the United States. Yet freedom did not immediately bring equality. The years that followed, known as Reconstruction, were filled with political conflict, economic hardship, and racial violence. Rebuilding the country proved almost as difficult as fighting the war itself. When historians ask why America split into two, The answer is more complex than a single issue. Slavery stood at the center of the conflict, but it was closely connected to economics, political power, and the debate over states' rights. The North believed the Union had to remain united under a strong federal government, while many Southern leaders believed states had the right to leave if they felt threatened. These differences grew larger over decades until compromise was no longer possible, and war became the tragic result. By the time the Civil War ended, more than 600,000 Americans had lost their lives, making it the deadliest conflict in the nation's history. Entire towns had been destroyed, countless families had been torn apart, and the United States was forever changed. Yet from that devastating conflict emerged a stronger federal government, the end of slavery, and a renewed commitment to keeping the nation together. More than 160 years later, the Civil War remains one of the most important chapters in American history, not only because it decided who won the war, but because it answered a far greater question. Would the United States survive as one nation or disappear as two? The answer came at an enormous cost, and its legacy continues to shape America even today.